There were some comments on my previous videos saying that they didn't think Tim Wise's diatribe was anti-white, but that it was anti-conservative. Now, first off, if it really was just a criticism of values, why didn't he just say conservatives? Why bring up race at all? So there's one reason to think he meant white people. Another thing to keep in mind is that most white people are conservatives, and whites are becoming more conservative, and the conservative movement is becoming more white. So even if Tim Wise only hates conservative whites and not all whites, well, that's still most white people. So even if this is true, then Tim Wise still hates most white people, and so it would be a mostly accurate statement to say that Tim Wise hates white people just there. Now that's pretty obvious, but let me try to put this another way. Tim Wise assumes innate racial equality in intelligence and industriousness between all the races on the aggregate. He obviously recognizes individual differences, but groups of people that are lumped into races, they all have to be the same, right? This is an impossible belief, right, given the racial differentiation in every other organ in the body, right, is not the same on average. It's an impossible belief, and it's also a religious belief. And from this foundation, Tim Wise looks at the world and sees inequality manifest. But all the races are all equal, right? That's the central dogma. So how can this be? How can there be this inequality? Well, whites are the least racist people on the planet now, right? That's ridiculously obvious. But white people were racist in the past. Thus, the effects of racism must still be lingering. But how? How can this be? Whites aren't discriminatory anymore. Oh, it must be the institutions. And with near certainty, we can assume that that's the core thought process that Tim Wise went through, and with everything else since then just being a rationalization for and a buttressing of this core stupidity. Tim Wise uses the idea of institutional racism to argue for taking wealth from whites and giving it to quote-unquote disadvantaged groups, and of granting more legal racial privileges to combat what Tim Wise believes is racism built into the institutions. Now, most whites are opposed to these programs, these programs of racial privilege and these programs of systemic theft. And Tim Wise hates the whites who are opposed to his program. Therefore, Tim Wise hates most whites. The only whites that Tim Wise doesn't hate are the whites who don't fight back against him. Imagine if there was a guy who wanted to enslave all black people, and he had a story to justify his program, right? It was to correct past injustices or whatever. He has a story, right? He's justified in what he's doing, enslaving all these black people. He then tells you that he doesn't hate all black people, that the only black people he hates are those who resist his program of enslavement. He then goes on to characterize these blacks as racist, the ones who resist him as racist, conservative bigots, and points to some fact that the blacks who are resisting him also tend to have a greater tendency to homophobia or something like that. So something irrelevant to the main point. Would it be fair to say that this man hates black people? Of course it would. Same with Tim Wise hating white people. Now, admittedly, it's a lesser degree. Okay. The degree he wishes to enslave white people doesn't approach chattel slavery, but of course all taxation is conscription of resources. It is slavery to a degree, and right now it's not very much, but again, whites are still the majority in the U.S. So I got the comments saying that Tim Wise was arguing against certain values, conservative values. And he wasn't arguing against conservative values. What he was doing was demonizing rural whites and trying to associate the opponents of his racial schemes with values that aren't relevant to the issue in question, right? Which is an economic issue. And if Tim really hates social conservatism so much, why doesn't he focus on blacks and Hispanics? Why this laser-like focus on whites and only whites who are social conservatives? Well, my answer is simple. Tim Wise hates white people, and he's using social conservative as an excuse, as a cover. And of course, Tim doesn't care about stereotyping. He doesn't care about the only group in the U.S. which is okay to call trash. He's happy to play up on stereotypes about rural whites to advance his supposedly compassionate agenda. And to be clear, they say white trash. To be very clear what they're saying. They don't mean trashy people generally. No, only whites. These are only white trash. In summary, to think that Tim Wise doesn't hate white people, you have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to explain away his singular, overwhelming focus on white people and the lengths to which he goes to justify these increasingly exotic and unfalsifiable hypotheses of implicit and institutional racism.